Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is the Byte Show. And we're really blessed to have David Sielaff with us. And you can contact David via email at this address, david@askelm.com. Their website is askelm.com, and the ELM stands for Ernest L. Martin. And David Sielaff is the Director of Associates for Scriptural Knowledge, and he does carry on the work of Dr. Ernest L. Martin. And right now, we're going to begin a new series, People That History Forgot. Hi, David.
Hi, GeorgeAnn. This is a book that Dr. Martin wrote in 1993, and I made minor alterations in 2003 when I edited the book. And this deals with the history of the introduction of paganism into the church. But it starts out on a totally different basis. And basically, I'm going to, first of all, read the introduction and forward, and then I'm going to we'll get right into chapter 1. And this book is in 2 parts, and we're going to do the whole book over a series of shows. First part deals with idolatry in the Christian church and paganism being inserted. And the second part deals with the race change that took part in Western Europe and how the Babylonian system came into Christianity. Now, others have written on this, but like Hislop's Two Babylons, which is an older book. But this take is a different angle on some of that same material. So let's get into the foreword of this book of Dr. Ernest Martin's The People That History Forgot. The first part of this book will show some modern archaeological discoveries that have caused amazement among scholars who study the history of early Judaism and Christianity. Indeed, the word shock would better describe the reaction of many historians, particularly those who are Jewish scholars. Now, what caused this shock? Well, the historical research in this book will explain the reason, and it will show what those surprising archaeological remains are and how their modern discovery actually reveals the existence of a people presently unrecognized by scholars who have mysteriously disappeared from the records of history about 1,400 years ago. In other words, about 600 AD. In this book, those people are rediscovered. The second part of the book reveals other archaeological finds that impinge upon the interpretation of the discoveries mentioned in the first part. They also affect the understanding of the early history of the Roman Empire, and consequently that of Judaism and early Christianity. This second group of discoveries involves the research of scholars in the first part of the 20th century who analyzed the remains of over 13,900 Latin inscriptions found primarily in Italy. The result of that survey profoundly altered the past understanding of the racial history of the period, from just before the time of Jesus to that of Constantine in the 4th century AD. Now, but strangely, actually, most historians today are not discussing the significance of this survey of Latin inscriptions regarding, nor do they give heed to that evidence. And consequently, the general public knows little or nothing about the importance of these discoveries. And by the way, these discoveries are not even in the textbooks of college age. You'd probably only learn about such material if you would get into graduate school, specialized courses in the Roman Empire, that sort of thing. However, Dr. Martin says, these archaeological remains are as significant in understanding early Judaism and Christianity, or more so, than even the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, what this book does is assemble together for the first time these important discoveries into a coherent narrative that will make sense to any interested reader. In a word, this book is designed to bring these amazing discoveries to the attention of the general public. And for that reason, I have not written in an academic style, Dr. Martin writes, but in a manner that the intelligent person from any walk of life can grasp. But the research is not exclusively for the general public. It is also designed to satisfy both professional historians and theologians in their quest to understand important historical events of the past. I believe the material in this book is essential for people to know if one hopes to realize some prime factors in the history of religion that have influenced the development of Western civilization. The subject of this book is of utmost importance, and these archaeological discoveries need to be made known to the public at large. The information can give scholars and all people a better comprehension of the history of early Judaism and Christianity, and a better understanding of the Roman Empire. Its central theme involves the rediscovery of the people that history forgot. Now, Dr. Martin then cites Proverbs 4 and verse 18. The path of the just is as the shining light that shines more and more unto the perfect day. Now, the back cover of this book shows the Serapis blessing, which is the first two fingers raised up on the left hand, and then the image of Serapis displayed in the palm of the right hand. In other words, a ring was put over the first two fingers next to the thumb, and then the image of Serapis was on that ring, and then it would be a blessing to the people that the priests would use. And the artifacts such as this are building tools to show the desire to create a new society. And some animals that are depicted in the Serapis blessing elsewhere all over the hand, some of those animals are changeable ones, depicting the change of the new society, like the snake that can change its skin, the chameleon that changes its color, and the tadpole that changes into a frog. The tortoise was an emblem of Mercury and Venus, and the ibis, or the stork, was universally sacred to Isis, and the stork indicates birth, the new birth of being like Serapis. The scales that are there, the balancing scales, show that all judgment belongs to Serapis, the judge of the dead. And of course, these are pagan symbols. But the blessing looks familiar, and you will recognize it in some church blessings. Now, then follows the bibliography. And then comes chapter 1, and we're going to get right into it. Chapter 1 of the history, the people that history forgot. Over the past 100 years or so, many archaeological discoveries have been found which have caused grave concern to Jewish scholars. All around the Mediterranean basin, and likewise, clockwise from Spain through southern France, Italy, the Balkans, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, Palestine, then going west toward Egypt and along the North African coast to Morocco, archaeologists have found the remains of what appear to be Jewish symbols from the tabernacle, combined with unmistakable Gentile themes. These are pagan depictions, designs or inscriptions carved or sketched on tombs, on dedication stones, or items painted on walls of dwellings, and even on the walls of synagogues. And these have been found in abundance, having and have been cataloged by Professor Erwin Goodenow in 12 magnificent volumes with an index volume. And these works were published between 1953 and 1968.
Are they still available, David?
They are available probably out of print, but they're probably available in large university libraries. And you spell the name, it's Erwin R. Goodenow, Goodenough. It's essentially good enough, but in one word. Now, Goodenow is to be praised for his indefatigable, that's it, work in collecting this valuable archaeological evidence, which basically originated but in the period from the 1st to the 6th century A.D., a long time, 6 centuries.
Yeah.
Thankfully, Professor Jacob Neusner has recently brought out an abridged edition in 1998 of the work. And this mass of archaeological information was something quite unexpected by Jewish scholars. And most were dismayed at what Goodenow revealed in his remarkable volumes. And what was totally unexpected, even by Professor Goodenow, when he was a young man beginning to study and to collect this archaeological evidence, was the astonishing amount of pagan decorations that were intermingled with typical ornaments associated with the tabernacle of Moses, such as the 7-branched lampstand known as the menorah, the Torah shrine for housing the Mosaic law, and other items connected with the ceremonial services of the tabernacle. The evidence of pagan intrusion into these artistic and architectural remains shows without doubt that these illustrated themes depicting human figures and pagan deities alongside items from the tabernacle were not manufactured by artists as mere decorations. The people who created them were incorporating these symbolic themes into their societal and religious beliefs, and they were displaying them for religious reasons in their most sacred of sites, in synagogues and burial grounds. Now, Jewish authorities were astonished at the amount of this archaeological evidence. To any normal Jewish scholar who is acquainted with the fundamental teachings of rabbinic Judaism over the past 2,000 years, he would have called such usage of symbols as being the practice of idolatry. The Jewish scriptures completely condemn such things, and the teachings and written records of rabbinic Judaism express an equal abhorrence. So surprising were Jewish scholars at what the archaeologists were uncovering that they were and still are in a state of shock at what they have seen with their own eyes. And this shock became especially acute when in the year 1932, the ruins of a synagogue were found in Syria, near the Euphrates, at a place called Dura Europos, which had paintings on its walls of Helios, the pagan sun god, Aphrodite, the pagan Venus, with Moses being taken out of the ark when he was a baby, while 3 nymphs look on. And also the heathen god Ares is shown supervising the exodus from Egypt, with victories, these are minor gods, bringing crowns of adornment. But that did not end the matter. Jewish scholars were further amazed a few years later with some new archaeological discoveries of synagogues in Galilee, in which were found mosaics of Helios, the sun god, and astrological signs with pagan decorations that could only have been used in a paganistic way by the people who produced them. These pagan designs could not have been placed in those synagogues as mere decorations. What was equally shocking about these discoveries is that they were found in, of all places, Galilee, in the very heartland of Jewish Palestine, where Jewish influence had come to be very strong after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Now, most Jewish scholars could hardly believe their eyes at what these new archaeological discoveries were showing. If these pagan depictions had been made by Jews and with the full approbation of the rabbinic authorities, it showed an unknown side of Judaism, which scholars had not realized before. It meant that the majority of the Jewish people were only giving lip service to observing the Mosaic Law, and that they had, in fact, gone over to practicing a form of idolatry that was unheard of in the time of the Second Temple, the time when Jesus and the apostles were alive. And these discoveries made the Jews from about the 4th to the 6th centuries of our era appear to be idolaters, and that their religious activities were no different, or only marginally so, from the generality of people in the Gentile world. So what must be emphasized is the fact that the archaeological remains of these 4th and 6th century synagogues in Galilee, along with similar burial grounds, were located in the region where rabbinic Judaism from the late 2nd century to the early 5th century had its origin, and where it flourished. With the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple in 70 AD, the Jewish authorities, with their Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish Supreme Court, mostly religious but sometimes secular laws were adjudicated by the Supreme Court, they moved to the coastal town of Jamnia, west of Jerusalem. The headquarters of Judaism was located in this area for about 60 years. But after the war with Hadrian in 135 AD, the Jewish authorities were prohibited from residing in this region at all, and they moved to a town named Usha in Galilee. And later, Rabbi Judah, around 200 AD, finally had the oral law codified, and that oral law is called the Mishnah. This literary endeavor was the catalyst around which rabbinic Judaism developed and flourished, and it has been the basis for Jewish belief until our time today. This important piece of literature was produced in Galilee, and for the next 2.25 centuries, This is where the Patriarchate, the headquarters for Rabbinic Judaism, had its headquarters before it was forbidden by the Roman government to continue. It was also in this region of Galilee that all the Jews in the world reckoned as the place of their Sanhedrin, their Supreme Court, and the area from which their religious and most of their social activities were then being governed. It was a very important religious center for the Jews. And this is the main reason why Jewish scholars were surprised at the archaeological discoveries of these synagogues in Galilee, along with the one in Dura Europos. It seemed to many scholars at first that this evidence showed the secret guilt of the rabbis in allowing pagan idolatrous artifacts and paintings to exist in the very heartland of Rabbinic Judaism, while supposedly condemning such practices in their literature. It made the Jewish authorities appear as blatant hypocrites. And it's no wonder that Jewish scholars were shocked about these discoveries. Now, after mature thinking on the matter over the past 30 years, some Jewish scholars have now tried to convince themselves that these were mere decorations that Jews were then allowing into their homes, their burial grounds, and their synagogues. Mere decorations? Well, if so, this would mean, as a modern parallel, that a person could go to Israel today, which happens to be where the modern chief rabbinates for Israel are resident, and one were to be invited into the home of one of the chief rabbis. And upon entering his home, one would see on the walls pictures or icons of the Madonna and Child, like in Greek Orthodox churches, a painting of Jesus being crucified on the Latin cross, and a reproduction of the Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, all positioned in prominent places. One would be amazed and indeed shocked to find such things in the home of the chief rabbi of Israel. But more than that, if the chief rabbi then invited the person to go to the main synagogue in Jerusalem, and the same decorations would be found there, even greater shock would be expressed. And further amazement would be forthcoming when one would then ask the chief rabbi and the authorities at the synagogue why they allow such scenes, which modern Judaism would consider idolatry, why they would allow such scenes to exist in the home of the chief rabbi and the main synagogue. And their answer would be, they are so beautiful that we decided to use them because they are nothing more than mere decorations. Well, then someone might say that this analogy is too severe and that it is not analogous to the pagan designs in the early Galilean synagogues and burial chambers. But the truth is, the comparisons are quite proper and valid. All people with any sense know that the pagan images and designs in the Dura Europos synagogue and in those Galilean synagogues were not placed there as mere decorations. The people who put them there were plainly and simply practicing a form of idolatry alongside their worship of the God of Israel. And since there were Jewish people in Galilee at the time, it means that the Jewish authorities must have allowed these synagogues to be built, along with burial areas being used by the people. So without doubt, the Jewish authorities allowed the artists to combine paganism with biblical teachings. True enough, these synagogues were being built and burial chambers being used mainly in the last 100 years of the Patriarchate, the court of the chief rabbi of the Jews, when it was in a much weakened state of authority. most of these things were in that time period. But those synagogues with their pagan themes were being erected and honored by all who built them. The archaeological remains are there for all to see, and the Jews allowed them to be built. And yes, Jewish authorities did indeed allow them to be built. But why? In this book it will be shown that the Jews let them to be constructed, allowed them to be constructed, because they had nothing to say in the matter. And this is because, as we will reveal in this research study, those particular synagogues were not built by mainline Jews. They were built and they were constructed mainly and used by the people that history forgot. So, thank you for this opportunity, GeorgeAnn, and we'll move on to part 2.
Oh, okay.
Or chapter 2.
All right. Well, why don't we just go ahead, because you're only at 26 minutes.
Sure.
Okay.
So let's go to chapter 2 of, let me get to it here. The people that history forgot. The chapter title is, Were 4th to 6th Century Jews Idolaters? Well, the plain archaeological evidence from around the Mediterranean world reveals a people who were mixing their paganism with biblical teaching, and doing it in the most conspicuous of places, their synagogues and burial grounds. The remains show a people clearly active throughout their lives in an unadulterated infusion of pagan motifs into biblical themes that most people, including scholars during the first part of this century, thought that normal Jews would have abhorred. And while it has long been known that mainline Jews did in fact use decorations to adorn their synagogues and burial places, and these were permissible in the time of the Second Temple, this allowance did not extend to decorating with images of pagan gods. Permissible decorations were those incorporating fruits and leaves, vines and circles, wheels, varieties of cross marks, which indicated the name Yahweh. If you look at Ezekiel 9 and verse 4, let's go to that real quick and read that. 9 and verse 4. And Yahweh said unto him, Pass through the midst of the city, and in the midst, Ezekiel is having a vision at this moment. Yahweh said to him, Pass through in the midst of the city, and in the midst of Jerusalem, and you will mark a mark on the foreheads of the men who are signing and groaning over all the abhorrences being committed in their midst. Now,
isn't that the passage where they talk about the man with the inkhorn and the slaughter weapons?
Exactly.
Yes. Can you read the whole thing, David?
The whole passage?
Yeah.
Let me see here. Let me go to Ezekiel 9. I've used a different translation.
Oh.
Ezekiel 9:1. See how long this goes. Yeah, it's the entire chapter. Well, I'll start. He also cried also in my ears with a loud voice, saying, Cause them that have charge over the city to draw near, even every man with his destroying weapon in his hand. And behold, 6 men came from the way of the higher gate, which lies toward the north, talking about the gate of the city, and every man a slaughter weapon in his hand. And one man among them was clothed with linen, with a writer's inkhorn by his side. And they went in and stood beside the brazen altar. So they did come into the temple. And the glory of the God of Israel was gone up from the cherub, whereupon he was to the threshold of the house, the threshold of the temple. And he called to the man clothed with linen, who was conducting Ezekiel in this vision, which had the writer's inkhorn by his side. And Yahweh said unto him, Go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and set a mark upon the foreheads of the men that sigh and that cry for all the abominations that are done in the midst thereof. And the others he said in my hearing, Go you after him through the city, and smite. Let not your eye spare, neither have you pity. Slay utterly, old and young, both maids and little children, and women. But come not near any man upon whom is the mark, and begin at my sanctuary. And then they began at the ancient men which were before the house. And he said unto them, Defile the house, and fill the courts with the slain, and go you forth. And he went forth and slew in the city, and it came to pass, while they were slaying them, and I was left, that I fell upon my face, and cried, and said, O Lord Yahweh, will you destroy all the residue of Israel in your pouring out of your fury upon Jerusalem? Then he said to me, The iniquity of the house of Israel and Judah is exceeding great, and the land is full of blood, and the city full of perversions. For they say, Yahweh has forsaken the earth, and Yahweh sees not. In other words, they were blaming Yahweh for their problems, in spite of their perversion, their blood of killing their own people. Verse 10, And as for me also, mine eye shall not spare, neither will I have pity, but I will recompense their way upon their head. And behold, the man clothed with linen, which had the inkhorn by his side, reported the matter, saying, I have done as you have commanded me. Now, Dr. Martin's reference to the inkhorn could very well be this, what the Jews in the Talmuds had said, that this refers to the mark was a cross that was put on the forehead. It's known that when they entered the temple by the altar of the red heifer, when you came from the east, and everyone had to come from the east, stop by the altar of red heifer, get some ashes, and then pay the temple tax. And they would put the ashes on their forehead. Whether they made this a cross sign at that time is unknown, but Dr. Martin is saying here that that's exactly what they did. So even in the synagogues without any pagan decorations, they had other motifs such as fruits, leaves, vines, circles, wheels, varieties of cross marks, as we said, indicated in Ezekiel 9:4, and even animals like the oxen that Solomon placed in the temple, as long as they were not in positions where people could bow down before them, which might give the impression of worshiping them. Even in the Talmud, it was acknowledged by one rabbi with very liberal tendencies, quote, that which is treated as a god is forbidden, but that which is not treated as a god is permitted. And this is from Herschel Shank's book, Judaism in Stone, page 147. Well, the opinion of this rabbi seemed to approach a liberalism that most other rabbis were not allowing at the time. And, you know, a synagogue was not a place, particularly after the temple was destroyed, a synagogue was not the kind of a place where no sacrifices were done there, and and even though corporate worship, and not even so much worship, but reading of the law and instruction was done in the synagogues. And obviously worship also, because the New Testament church, the ecclesia, was in many, many ways run and conducted like a synagogue service. So that there would be a liturgy from which they would read a passage of the text, sometimes at great length, and then someone would give a lecture or a speech, and there would be discussion. And back to what Dr. Martin has said, as I said, this rabbi was even this rabbi was conservative compared to the synagogues that had pagan symbols, because he was not giving the slightest hint that his liberalism extended to an allowance of setting up pagan idols or images. All images or idols of heathen gods were in one way or another made for idolatrous purposes and not for mere decorations.
Yeah, that's for sure.
But in the Byzantine period, when mosaics first came into prominent use, some rabbis asserted that it was allowed to depict designs in mosaic fashion. Somehow they were allowed to depict these designs in mosaic fashion. Now, by mosaic, it means, with the little tiles and stuff.
Yeah.
And this is in Herschel Shank's Judaism in Stone, page 148. And this was a simple allowance to use mosaics, which were then becoming a common architectural form of decoration. But the permission did not include the portrayal of pagan idols or images in those mosaics, which were expressly designed to be used for idolatrous purposes. And none of the rabbis had such allowances in mind, and the Talmudic texts did not justify such a conclusion. In other words, there's a disconnect between the Jewish texts of the period and what is seen in some synagogues, and there were other synagogues that had none of these pagan or idolatrous decorations. So the permission of the rabbis mentioned above was simply to allow a continuation of what was permitted in the time of Jesus. And it should be mentioned that Jesus himself, apparently with complete approbation for the practice, said unto the Pharisees, in Matthew 23, verse 29, you are building, and this is in present tense, you are building the graves of the prophets, and you are decorating, also present tense, the tombs of the righteous. And what Jesus was meant, and what he was referring to, was the making of new tombs for the prophets of old, which were located outside the 2,000 cubit zone from the temple. And this zone had been created by legislation in the early 1st century by Jerusalem authorities. And they defined into law a newly prohibited area in which tombs were not allowed to exist in Jerusalem, except those tombs of David and the prophetess Huldah. And I have given examples of such tombs and ossuaries. Boxes are for the bones of the dead, which had their placements in areas assigned to them outside the 2,000 cubit zone. And this is also discussed in Dr. Martin's book, Secrets of Golgotha. Now, these ossuaries, when a person died, like Jesus, for example, when a person died, his body was put in spices and then set aside in a shelf, and then a couple of years later, the loved ones would come back and the body will have deteriorated. So they would unwrap the body, the flesh would have come off, and all that would be left were bones. And the bones would be placed in a box called an ossuary. And these are stone boxes. And then those boxes, which were smaller, would be reburied. And the reason this was done was primarily because they were running out of space for burial in the area of Jerusalem. Everybody wanted to be there. It's like Arlington Cemetery in Washington, D.C. They're frankly running out of space. And the valuable land needed to be reused. So they initiated this thing properly with the approbation of the rabbis, approval of the rabbis and the Sanhedrin, the religious ruling body, that said, okay, now we're going to start doing this. And it probably started out with the rich people doing it, and then everyone wanted to follow that tradition because they weren't allowed to bury their dead in, say, in the Mount of Olives facing the temple. And they were running out of room, so they had to go to the ossuary system. Now back to Dr. Martin's text. Such decorating of these ossuaries in the time of Jesus, and the tombs, by the way, of these tombs and ossuaries in the time of Jesus can be seen at the Sanhedria tombs northwest of the old city of Jerusalem. The entrance to the tombs shows various carvings of acanthus leaves, pomegranates, and citrons. Jesus may have had these very decorations in mind when he mentioned what the Pharisees were doing at that time. There was no censure from Jesus in the building or the decorating of tombs, although he did inform the Pharisees that their attitudes were wrong and were the same as their ancestors who killed the prophets that they were moving the burial places for. But the outright portrayal of pagan gods in sacred areas such as synagogues was not permitted in the time of Jesus. And the Jewish authorities who compiled the Talmud and other literature from the 2nd to the 4th centuries also condemned such depictions. Yet non-idolatrous decorations had long been allowed in the period of the Second Temple when Jesus was teaching. Of course, any design or symbol, even those in the temple, could be made to be pagan if one wishes to read a pagan theme into them. Anything in the world can be designated as idolatrous if a person wishes to name it so. And this would include the designs and symbols found in the Second Temple. For example, a 6-pointed Star of David, which is a modern Jewish symbol that denotes the Jewish people and the state of Israel, could be construed, if one wished to do so, as an idolatrous star god. But most mainline Jews would not adopt that interpretation. And
it's also been looked at as an occult symbol.
Yes, exactly. But most mainline Jews would not adopt that interpretation, either one, and properly so. Let's look at another example. It is not surprising to find a flagpole in a Jewish schoolroom in New York City with the United States flag portrayed with an American eagle on top of the flagpole. And this is because that eagle doesn't have the slightest idolatrous meaning to the Jewish teachers and the children who attend that school. Most Christians commonly do the same thing and would not think it idolatrous, and Dr. Martin says, I certainly don't, and neither do I. And this example of the American flagpole is nothing like that of Herod when he erected a golden eagle over the east portal of the temple, which Josephus said was against the law. Josephus showed that many Jews were outraged over this action of King Herod, which they did not think was proper to do. This is in the Antiquities of the Jews, written by Josephus, the Jewish historian, in Book 7, Section 6.
And that just goes to show us that prominent egotistical leaders take their place above the law then as they do today.
Yes, and this was, he was trying to please his literal Roman masters.
Yeah.
Because Rome was a symbol of, or the eagle was a symbol of Rome too.
Yeah.
They would put eagles, which standards for each legion had a standard. And on top of the standard was an eagle, and then from there down, 3 to 4 feet, was a hanging in cloth embroidered with something. Mm-hmm. For example, the 10th legion that was formed by Julius Caesar and that fought at the war against the Jews in 70 A.D. in Jerusalem. They had a boar, a wild boar emblem on their flag of their standard, the eagle standard. And all those standards together were called eagles. Mm-hmm. So let's go back to Dr. Martin's text. But using New York City as an example, one could leave that Jewish school or a Jewish synagogue in New York and walk a few blocks and find a Roman Catholic church with displays of a Madonna and child, a painting of Jesus on the cross, and a reproduction of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. People could also find a Methodist or a Baptist church with a portrait of Jesus having long hair and a beard, just like the pagans used to picture Zeus, the Egyptian Serapis, or Asclepius, the pagan god of healing. In fact, if the apostles would walk into many churches today, they would be aghast at the pictures of pagan gods that are now being called Jesus or the apostles or other New Testament saints. A lot of churches are called St. Stephen in Roman Catholicism or St. Philip. And as we know, churches and Sunday schools or Sabbath school books are filled with pictures of Jesus in the manner that the pagans worshipped their pagan deities. And now let us return to those synagogues and those burial chambers that were found in Galilee. And just as in New York or in any modern American city, there will be numerous churches in a short distance from one another that differ in architecture and religious designs because we are a very pluralistic society. The same thing was occurring in Galilee in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries because it was also a pluralistic society. And Galilee was long known as Galilee of the nations. And this is in Matthew 4 and verse 15. Because many non-Jews also lived in the area. In Galilee during that time, it was possible to leave Jewish synagogues and find others not far away with pagan designs and idolatrous symbols. Galilee was a pluralistic area, like most of the modern areas in America. And there were people living there who had varieties of religious beliefs over which the Jewish rabbinate had no control. These people could build synagogues wherever they received authority to do so from the public officials. And that is what they were doing. And while the Jews from the 4th to the 6th centuries did allow various decorations in their own synagogues and burial places, like those of the Second Temple period, outright images and depictions of the gods of the heathen were expressly forbidden by the Jewish authorities from the time of the Second Temple period onward. And yet, in the archaeological remains that Goodenow had reference to, for the most part, there were simply too many pagan items being shown, and in strategic areas, that calling the remains as mere decorations is not a satisfactory one. So the conclusion of many historians to this archaeological evidence is that the Jewish people from the 4th to the 6th centuries present a different picture of their religious beliefs than what all of the luminous writings and teachings of the Jewish authorities would have us believe represented normal Judaism. Among Jewish literature written during those centuries, there is not a scrap of evidence that would suggest that mixing the worship of the pagan gods with themes of the Bible was in any way proper. In fact, all the early Jewish writings make it plain that those Jewish authorities at the time would have been horrified at such activities by the Jewish population, especially with the designs on the synagogues in Galilee and those paintings on the wall at Dura Europos. Now, there are other explanations to account for this, and we will show in this research study that the people in the main who left these archaeological remains were principally the people that history forgot, and that those people were not Jews. That is, they were not mainline practicing Jews. And true enough, we must be practical and admit that we humans are not always are not always faithful to religious principles that we outwardly profess. And there could very well have been a few Jews involved in this idolatry that the archaeological remains disclose. It is only logical to assume that there were always renegade individuals or families, or even towns of Jews who left mainstream Judaism and mainstream Jewish belief from the 2nd to the 6th centuries, who would have become part of the people who were doing these idolatrous themes, who adopted these idolatrous themes. But what I'm stating is my firm belief that this paganized artwork was not the product of mainline rabbinic Judaism in the first centuries of our era. So the Jews are off the hook, but now Dr. Martin has to show his evidence in regard to this. And these people who left these archaeological remains, cataloged primarily by Professor Goodenow, have to be identified as idolaters in the classical sense of the word, whereas the mainline Jews were not. And I'm stating this belief simply because the evidence, which I will soon give in the next chapters, that shows that rabbinic Judaism was not guilty of practicing these idolatrous acts. And in this matter, I'm not trying to whitewash the Jewish authorities. Dr. Martin says, all of us know that many organizations in which humans are involved, Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, are subject to practicing errors. And I'm not defending rabbinic Judaism itself, or any Christian organization of which Dr. Martin was a part. But he is justifying rabbinic Judaism from the 2nd to the 6th centuries against any charge of idolatry or the use of idolatrous practices. And other people did those pagan designs of which I have been speaking. And we will find that they were depicted by the people that history forgot. So thank you, GeorgeAnn, for the introduction and chapters 1 and 2 of this very intriguing book.
Boy, it sure is, David. Wow. We'll have to get together ASAP and do 3 and 4.
Okay.
Oh, boy. Thank you so much. And everybody, you can email David at this address, david@askelm.com. And their website is askelm.com. And you can find all these audio files and oodles more at thebyteshow.com. Go to the audio library, click on David Sielaff's name, and his page will open up with more audio files than you can listen to in 10 years. So
ours, not just mine.
Yeah. So enjoy, everybody. And God bless everyone out there that's listening. Good night.